Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, early May 1989, a New York Times story runs that points out that as the Cold War is thawing, more and more American companies are doing business in Russia, sending their products behind the Iron Curtain. And one company is Pepsi, which had actually done that for a long time. There's a long history of Pepsi showing up in Russia, going back decades. And over the years, they'd accepted a bunch of things in exchange for those soft drinks, not just cash, but also vodka and pizza sauce. And according to this New York Times article, in exchange for this most recent shipment of Pepsi, the company was given 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer. That is right, a naval fleet for a sugary drink, a classic swap. So let's talk about the time that Pepsi got its hands on some leftover Russian naval weaponry. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
You Pepsi folks, you Coca-Cola folks, you RC Cola folks, where do you come down?
Oh, Coke all the way.
Yeah. I come down hard on Coke Zero, and
that's
not Coke Zero. No.
Coke
oh
Zero.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I've moved away from Diet Coke into the Coke Zero realm. And so we have never been a Pepsi household, but I didn't know that the exchange rate for Pepsi was so high and exotic.
A frigate.
So maybe it's worth doing a switch.
Yeah,
I know. I used to be a Pepsi fan, and then I switched to Coke, and I can't go back. And now when I go to restaurants and they're like, sorry, all we have is Pepsi products, I'm like, I'll take water.
Wow.
I'm right there with you, Kellie.
Well, listeners, that is how you all know that none of us grew up behind the Iron Curtain, because otherwise we would be Pepsi fans. Because it is true that Pepsi has this long history. Maybe let's start there before we get to the naval swap. But Pepsi has this long history in the USSR, going back, all the way into the 60s, it seems like.
I find this to be kind of surprising because it's contra the story I think we're often told, that the Soviet Union is wrapped in this Iron Curtain and they had no choice in consumption. They had really no consumer culture. But as part of the kind of thaw in U.S.-Soviet relations in the late 1960s, the importation of U.S. products became part of what it meant to set up formal relations with Russia. It wasn't just, diplomatic relations. It wasn't just talks about nuclear weapons, but it was also introducing U.S. businesses into the Soviet Union. And the Nixon administration, apparently they were big Pepsi fans because they were helping out behind the scenes to get Pepsi behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, to me, this seems sort of like, we did an episode on when we talked about McDonald's in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I feel like we did that not too long ago. But when I think about sort of like how a lot of these relationships thaw, it's so interesting to me that it's the commodities, it's these like either music or a sport or some sort of product that becomes like this gateway drug into allowing other ideas and influences to sort of take over. But no one would think a drink would do that. And yet somehow these things have ways of being quite pervasive and sort of spreading to other things.
And not to take us too far down this road, but it is sort of like this is the opposite of a boycott in a way. I was thinking about this because Coca-Cola plays a big role in the anti-apartheid boycotts in South Africa. It's a big move when the Coca-Cola company starts to make demands on South Africa. And there were also all of these boycotts around Soviet products in the 1950s and 1960s. And so here you're seeing kind of the carrot to the stick, I think.
Yeah, it is worth highlighting how kind of there's ebbs and flows to the relationship between consumer products and business and these geopolitical ties. And certainly, yes, in the late 80s, those become very married. And that's actually an amazing Pepsi commercial that ran here in the United States.
Oh, yes.
That we'll play a clip of it at the end of the show, but it basically is like saying young people in Russia are drinking Pepsi and their parents are upset about it, and a new change is on the way, and, you know, the world is changing because of our product. I would say, 10, 15, 20 years earlier, when Pepsi was also in the Soviet Union, it was a little bit more like there will always be businessmen in every country who just want to find a way to make some money, and I think that's
trying to make $1 out of 15 cents.
And that's a big part of the story, both on the Russian side and on the U.S. side, that, Pepsi is just very aggressive about going into a new market. The head of Pepsi is this guy, Donald Kendall, in the 60s and 70s. And Kissinger is quoted as saying, look at Kendall of Pepsi-Cola. He would sell the country for a contract, and so he's just ruthless, sees a market. But also, I think there's this sort of dance that the U.S. has to play where they realize that, okay, I don't know how we feel about this, hyper-capitalist going in there and just sort of exploiting this market behind the Iron Curtain. But it may not be the worst thing in the world that Russian consumers are becoming exposed to American goods. And so I think there is just this always sort of swirling, sliding scale of tension. And then it sort of, coalesces into the late 80s as a real wedge. I mean, it's like Pepsi, McDonald's, and blue jeans and basketball, really kind of start to change things. But, Pepsi in the 70s is the first American consumer product manufactured and sold in the Soviet Union. And Pepsi has plants, 16 bottling plants in the 80s in the USSR.
That is both surprising, given the narratives back in the U.S. about the Soviet Union. I think it's also worth probing a little bit more into what this economic relationship look like, because there are some signs that this is not, Pepsi opening a factory in the United States or Pepsi opening a factory in France. In this case, the ruble is not considered the most stable of currencies. And so Pepsi is getting paid for its product, but it's not getting paid in currency. It is getting paid in sort of the trade and goods. And this is how we start to get to the story of the frigates.
Military equipment.
Right. Because for so long, Pepsi wasn't being paid in cash. It was being paid in stolichynaya vodka. And so they're taking all this vodka back to the United States and selling that as this authentically Soviet product. They're being paid in all of these different kinds of goods. And by the late 1980s, vodka is less the product of choice, and this military that the Soviet Union is beginning to dismantle becomes a source of new soda funds.
Interested in the forces shaping our world? The Council on Foreign Relations has you covered. For those who like to look ahead, dive into The World Next Week, hosted by Bob McMahon and Carla Ann Robbins.
We were not forecasting anything about Russian domestic upheaval, and yet that has been the story of the week.
These are scorpions going after each other in a bottle.
And for those who want to go beyond the headlines, join Jim Lindsay as he opens up the president's inbox.
What should U.S. policy do?
The approach towards China, it's enough to make me question bipartisanship.
And finally, join me, Gabrielle Sierra, on Why It Matters, as my guests and I bring some of the world's most compelling stories home to you.
Do you feel good about where we're heading with AI?
Maybe we need to invent a new word here, which kind of is a combination of frightened and excited. I'm excited.
So what are you waiting for?
For the world next week, the president's inbox.
And Why It Matters. We'll see you soon.
This is what kills me. How do you go from Pepsi for vodka to you want a submarine? It doesn't translate. But in some ways, you see how Pepsi plays a role in, I don't know if you could call it the demilitarization of Russia, because obviously they still have, weapons of warfare. But the way in which Pepsi is sort of taking advantage of this opportunity to say, listen, we are getting real machinery or technology. Now it's all used for scrap metal. I mean, literally these
Oh, you mean they don't retrofit the guns to shoot Pepsi?
The Pepsi Army.
Yeah.
No, there's no Pepsi army. But I think it's an interesting way of thinking about, this is what we want to exchange or trade, and is the government a part of this? Like that to me is also something that just feels sort of like awkward.
Well, the Soviet government is part of it. The U.S. government, I think, there's probably a conversation somewhere about what kinds of products they're getting.
Say, by the way, we just picked up these subs.
Well, especially because picking up those subs meant at one point Pepsi had the 7th largest navy in the world.
Yes!
Pepsi Cola.
I love it.
Multinational corporations, people.
It's probably more sort of sign than a symbol of something than anything that Russia has now come down to, like, oh gosh, what is the valuable thing that we have left?
What's left?
And it's, these decommissioned ships, which would be sold for scrap metal. Yeah, so I don't think it's necessarily exactly weakening the Soviet defense capabilities, but it is a symbol of a weakened Soviet Union for sure.
And it fits in pretty well with that commercial we're going to play at the end, which is, Pepsi's motto during the 1980s was the choice of a new generation. And then there's this generational change coming to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is about to collapse. But also that Pepsi is part of that process of trading old military equipment for new consumer goods.
Yeah.
Like the symbolism of that is pretty powerful.
Yeah. It is.
Yeah. So I just want to go through the list of other things that had been bartered over the years because it is really interesting. So yeah, I mean, the basic idea here is that you basically couldn't pull off a normal trade, which is where you would get sort of funds for your goods. And so there was always this barter. And so yes, there was, it's so cliche, but there was vodka for Pepsi trade. I mean, it's like ChatGPT writing that, It's so, but there was a vodka for Pepsi trade. Supposedly Pepsi also bartered goods for tomato paste, which it then used in European Pizza Huts. And so there's a nice little sort of vertical integration into gastronomic Cold War. The PepsiCo company wasn't the only one doing this. So apparently the Swedish supergroup ABBA, which was very popular in the Soviet Union, when it earned royalties, it did not get paid in cash, but it actually got paid in fruits and vegetables and crude oil, which it then turned around and sold on the global market. And so I just love that someone on ABBA's management team had to watch the crude oil markets in order to sell the barrels that were coming their way because their songs were so popular. Behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah. Right, they're waiting for another embargo so they can really make bank.
Yeah. And, it's worth saying that these kinds of trades still happen. I mean, people trade goods for goods. Iran trades oil for Indian rice. It's not like, but I don't know of any that are kind of this random seeming.
Yeah.
And I do think that the Iran oil for Indian rice is two states in trade with one another, it seems like. And I do think
corporation
makes it special that it's Pepsi that is bringing in all of these former Soviet military equipment.
Yeah. There's an interesting thing that happens into 1989 and into 1990 with this. So first off, this guy, Donald Kendall, same guy. I mean, 60s, 70s, 80s into the 90s is still the one running Pepsi. He seems to really be the engine behind all of this and super aggressive about this market. Funnily enough, I think there's some anxiety when the Iron Curtain falls that Pepsi has lost a market that it has been super exclusive in, and it's sort of counterintuitive. But from a purely kind of bottom line perspective, I don't know how good Pepsi feels about the U.S., quote unquote, winning the Cold War.
Yeah, I think that is a fair concern, especially because the Soviet Union may be falling apart and opening its markets, but the biggest competitor of Pepsi, Coca-Cola, still has a corner on the market in China.
Yeah.
Where it is sort of operating exclusively. And so Pepsi is potentially losing its market advantage at the same time that Coca-Cola has still secured its. So it'd be interesting to think about what the geopolitics of these soda companies are.
I was just thinking about like how we think about almost like a corporate scramble for the rest of the world to be able to get their foot in the door, to have these monopolies and sustain them as long as they possibly can, or to have this sort of like market share as long as they possibly can. It's funny, when I took a trip to China several years ago, a long time ago actually, and to see like Coca-Cola is everywhere, to see Pizza Hut there and McDonald's, and to see sort of like the globalization of what American products look like overseas, and the different ways that it's consumed as well. Because when you think about Pizza Hut in America, it's kind of womp. But when you think about it in China, it's considered fine dining. And so I wonder too, like how much are Russians consuming Pepsi with almost like a cachet to it as opposed to having like a Pepsi in America feels like nothing.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's definitely an understood kind of statement there when you're consuming an American good that way. So just to put a finer point on the kind of what happens after the breakup of the Soviet Union, I mean, Kendall is quoted as saying, one of our biggest partners has just gone out of business, and that's a major problem for any company. And the ripple effects are fascinating. So Pepsi, runs Pizza Hut as well. And Pizza Hut is a big part of the story. There's Pizza Huts all over Europe. They're moving into Eastern Europe. But, the shipyard, for instance, that these tankers that Pepsi was selling to then finance the Pizza Huts and the bottling plants in Russia, those were now in Ukraine. And this new country of Ukraine wanted revenues from those ship sales. The mozzarella cheese that it needed to open Pizza Huts in Moscow were now in Lithuania, and it was expensive to import those. And so, you get all of a sudden you have to deal with a bunch more markets and a bunch more countries and a bunch more trade regulations. And so, yes, I think we see that Pepsi kind of liked the simplicity of having one partner, even if that partner was ostensibly, the bad guys.
The sides of authoritarianism.
Yeah.
But Pepsi's doing all right.
I think Pepsi's doing
they're
all
doing
right.
fine.
Yeah.
They're doing just fine.
Yeah.
Their sales grew by $2.1 billion in 2022. So I think they're okay.
Yeah. And it is fascinating how you get these parts of the world and even parts of the country where just like it's Pepsi territory or Coke territory, and you wonder why. And a lot of times it has to do with these kinds of little geopolitical maneuvering. It's not just a coincidence or local taste. All right. Well, let's leave it there. That was a fun episode. We've been wanting to get to it for a while. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Not very long ago, America introduced Pepsi to the Soviet Union. And while it may be just a coincidence, a lot of refreshing changes have taken place ever since. Pepsi, a generation ahead.